I still remember the way the air seemed to freeze in that attorney's office 16 years after my parents abandoned me. Everyone sat in expensive chairs, waiting for Uncle Frank's will to be read. My parents, who I barely recognized anymore, wore smug expressions until the lawyer read that one line, the line that made every head in the room snap toward them, then me. At 14, they left me for opportunity abroad. At 30, I watched them realize what that decision truly cost them. Some lessons come too late. Growing up in Lakeside, Wisconsin, we lived in a modest 3-bedroom house that my parents, Jack and Linda Hayes, constantly complained was too small for their ambitions. Dad worked as a medical equipment salesman, his income fluctuating wildly, depending on commissions. Mom bounced between receptionist jobs, never staying anywhere longer than a year, always convinced she deserved better. They maintained appearances at all costs, stretching credit cards to their limits to keep up with neighbors who earned twice what we did. My childhood memories are colored by the constant undercurrent of financial stress. My parents whispered arguments about money behind closed doors, but the walls in our house were thin. I learned to gauge their financial state by the volume of those late-night discussions and the number of collection calls that came during dinner. Uncle Frank stood in stark contrast to their instability. Dad's older brother by 7 years, he visited from Chicago several times annually, always bringing thoughtful gifts and stories about his real estate developments. Where my father was loud and impulsive, Uncle Frank was measured and deliberate. He had built his company, Hayward Developments, from nothing after putting himself through college. During his visits, he would take genuine interest in my school projects and sports activities, while my parents mostly used his presence to network or angle for connections. Ramon, success isn't about what you have, Uncle Frank told me once after I admired his watch. It's about building something that stands, even when you're not there to prop it up. By the time I turned 12, the frequency of Uncle Frank's loans to my parents increased. They never called them loans, of course. They were family helping family, or temporary assistance according to my father, who became increasingly defensive whenever Uncle Frank visited. I noticed how my mother would suddenly suggest shopping trips when Uncle Frank was in town, returning with bags from stores we normally wouldn't even enter. The summer before I turned 14, things began unraveling faster. Dad lost his biggest client and spent more evenings drinking on the porch rather than looking for new business. Mom maxed out their 3rd credit card and stopped opening bills altogether. The arguments grew louder, no longer confined to nighttime or closed doors. We could make 10 times this in Australia, Mom said repeatedly, waving international job listings she'd found online. Frank's money would be an investment, not a handout. Dad would nod vigorously. He owes me anyway. I introduced him to the Pattersons back in college, and look what that connection did for his business. Uncle Frank visited less frequently but called more often, asking to speak to me rather than my parents. During these calls, he would ask careful questions about how things were at home, whether I had everything I needed for school, if Mom and Dad seemed okay. I downplayed the worst parts, feeling somehow responsible for maintaining our family's dignity. My 14th birthday fell on a Tuesday. I remember because I had a math test that day, and was grateful for the distraction from the fact that my parents had seemingly forgotten. No presents waited at breakfast. No special dinner plans were mentioned. I'd stopped expecting much on birthdays years ago, but this felt different, like I'd become invisible in my own home. I returned from school to find the house unnaturally quiet. The driveway was empty, which wasn't unusual, but something felt wrong immediately. The kitchen, normally cluttered with unopened mail and unwashed dishes, was suspiciously clean. My backpack slid from my shoulder as I noticed a folded piece of paper on the counter with my name written in my mother's hurried script. Ramon, we've taken positions in Sydney. The opportunity came suddenly and couldn't wait. We've arranged for you to stay with Uncle Frank, who has agreed to take you in. This is better for everyone. We'll send for you once we're established. There's $50 in the envelope. Call Frank. He'll arrange your travel. Love, Mom and Dad. The $50 was actually $37. I later learned they'd cleared our joint savings account where my summer job money had been deposited. They'd taken the family photo albums, but left my childhood artwork. They'd packed their valuable jewelry, but left their wedding portrait hanging crookedly on the wall. They had chosen a new life that simply didn't include me. I sat on the kitchen floor for hours, reading and rereading the note, searching for some hidden explanation that would make sense of why parents would leave their child behind. The house felt cavernous around me, echoing with the finality of their decision. When darkness fell, I finally called the number Uncle Frank had made me memorize for emergencies. "They're gone," was all I managed to say when he answered. "I'll be there tomorrow morning," he replied without hesitation. "Pack what matters to you. The rest we can replace." That night, I slept in my parents' bed, breathing in the lingering scent of my mother's perfume, trying to understand what I had done to make myself so easy to abandon. In the morning, I would discover something even more devastating about their departure, something that would forever change how I viewed them and myself. Uncle Frank arrived in a sleek black SUV, driven by a man he introduced as Carter, his personal assistant. He embraced me tightly when he saw me standing in the driveway, with my hastily packed duffel bag and backpack. "I'm sorry, kid," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "You deserved better than this." I expected him to ask questions, to demand explanations I didn't have. Instead, he helped me load my meager belongings into the vehicle and did a final walkthrough of the house with me. "Is there anything else you want to take?" he asked, as I stood in my bedroom, looking at the posters and books I was leaving behind. "Will we come back?" My voice sounded small and foreign to my own ears. Uncle Frank placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "No, Ramon. I don't think so." It was only when we stopped for lunch, 2 hours into our drive to Chicago, that Uncle Frank showed me the second note my parents had left, the one addressed to him rather than me. They had asked for $50,000 as startup capital for their Australian venture. They had framed my care as a temporary arrangement, perhaps 6 months at most. And they had, as a final insult, suggested that caring for me would be good for Frank, who never had kids of his own. "They emptied their accounts 3 weeks ago," Uncle Frank explained gently. "They'd been planning this for some time. The realization that my abandonment had been methodically arranged, not a sudden decision, hit me like a physical blow. I excused myself to the restaurant bathroom and vomited until my stomach ached as much as my heart." Frank's Chicago penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a gleaming downtown building that bore the Hayward Development logo. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views that made our Wisconsin town seem like it existed in another universe entirely. A housekeeper, named Mrs. Winters, showed me to a guest room larger than my entire previous bedroom. "This will be your room unless you'd prefer another," Uncle Frank said. "We can redecorate it however you like." I nodded wordlessly, overwhelmed by the luxury and terrified of seeming ungrateful. That first night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window watching the Chicago skyline glitter, feeling like an imposter in someone else's life. Uncle Frank didn't try to replace my parents immediately. Instead, he established clear expectations and routines. We had breakfast together every morning, during which he would share his schedule and ask about my plans. He enrolled me in Lakefront Preparatory Academy, an exclusive private school where the tuition cost more than my parents' mortgage payments. "Education is an investment no one can take from you," he told me when I expressed anxiety about the cost. "And Ramon, I need you to understand something important. Money spent on you is never wasted." At Lakefront Prep, I felt painfully out of place. My classmates carried designer bags and discussed summer homes with casual familiarity. I wore the required uniform, but lacked their confidence and social connections. In classes, I sat silently, afraid that speaking would reveal me as the abandoned child of con artists. 3 months after moving in with Uncle Frank, I was still keeping emotional distance, convinced he would eventually tire of the arrangement. One evening, he invited me into his home office, a warm space lined with books and family photographs. "We need to talk about your parents," he said, gesturing for me to sit across from him. My stomach clenched. This was it, the moment he would explain that the burden was too great, that other arrangements would be made. Instead, he slid a folder across his desk. Inside were reports from private investigators and financial documents tracing wire transfers to Australia. "They're in Brisbane, not Sydney," Uncle Frank explained calmly. "They used my last loan to establish themselves in a beachfront apartment. Your father has taken a sales position with a pharmaceutical company, and your mother is working at a high-end boutique." The folder contained photographs. My parents on a sunny terrace, toasting with champagne glasses. My mother in a dress I'd never seen, laughing with strangers. My father driving a convertible with the top down. "There have been no inquiries about you," Uncle Frank continued gently. "No calls checking on your welfare. No attempts to send messages or money." I closed the folder, unable to look at the evidence of their new, unburdened life any longer. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Because you need to understand that their choices reflect their character, not your worth," Uncle Frank replied, leaning forward. "Ramon, some people aren't capable of the love that children deserve. That's their failure, not yours." "They're my parents," I whispered, tears finally breaking through the emotional wall I'd built. "Biology makes parents, but actions make family," Uncle Frank countered firmly. "You have two choices now. Let their abandonment define you, or use it as fuel to build something better." That night marked the true beginning of my healing. Uncle Frank didn't offer false comfort or empty promises. Instead, he offered something much more valuable: the truth, delivered with compassion, and a path forward that honored my pain without allowing it to become my identity. Over the following months, Uncle Frank introduced structure into my life that had previously been absent. He expected excellent grades, not because he demanded perfection, but because he genuinely believed in my capabilities. During summer breaks, I worked entry-level positions at Hayward Developments, learning the business from the ground up alongside other employees' children. "Privilege, without responsibility, creates entitlement," Uncle Frank explained. "You'll never appreciate what you haven't worked to understand." The Christmas after my 15th birthday, Uncle Frank formally filed for legal guardianship. He presented the papers to me first, making it clear that the decision was ultimately mine. "I want you to stay, Ramon," he said, without pretense. "Not temporarily, not as a favor to your parents, but permanently, as my family. But I need you to want that too." I signed the papers without hesitation. For the first time since being abandoned, I felt chosen rather than discarded. That night, Uncle Frank taught me how to make his grandfather's secret recipe eggnog, sharing family stories and traditions as if I had always been part of them. It was the first Christmas that felt like a genuine celebration in years. Lakefront Preparatory Academy's imposing Gothic architecture had once intimidated me. By junior year, its stone corridors felt comfortably familiar. The transition hadn't been easy. My first year was marked by academic struggles as I adjusted to the rigorous curriculum and social isolation as I navigated the complex hierarchy of wealthy teenagers. Uncle Frank hired tutors without complaint and listened patiently to my frustrated outbursts when I felt overwhelmed. "Anything worth having takes time to build," he reminded me regularly. "That includes confidence and friendships." He was right. By 16, I had developed a small but loyal group of friends who knew fragments of my story and didn't define me by it. My grades had improved dramatically, particularly in mathematics and economics, subjects Uncle Frank and I would discuss over dinner, debating theories and analyzing real-world applications. Uncle Frank's mentorship extended beyond academics. He taught me practical skills my parents had never bothered with: how to maintain a household budget, how to change a tire, how to negotiate effectively, how to identify quality in everything, from clothing to character. "Pay attention to details," he advised, during a suit, fitting for a school formal. "How something is made tells you everything about whether it will last." At Hayward Developments, I graduated from filing paperwork to shadowing project managers during my 17th summer. Uncle Frank introduced me as his nephew, but never pulled rank to give me special treatment. Instead, he pushed me harder than other summer employees, expecting thorough analysis and thoughtful questions. "If you're going to lead someday, You need to understand every aspect of what you're leading, he explained one evening as we reviewed property assessments in his home office. Success without comprehension is just luck, and luck eventually runs out. Track became my sanctuary at school. Running gave me an outlet for residual anger, and a metric of progress I could control completely. Uncle Frank never missed a meet, standing quietly at the finish line with a stopwatch, noting my times without comment unless asked. You shaved 7 seconds off your personal best, he remarked after one particularly grueling race. That's the result of consistency, not talent. Consistency beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. By senior year, I had transformed from the abandoned, uncertain 14-year-old into someone I barely recognized, someone stronger, more focused, more comfortable in my own skin. College applications dominated our conversations, with Uncle Frank encouraging me to aim for top business programs. Your past is a fact, but not a limitation, he insisted when I expressed doubt about my chances at elite universities. Share your story truthfully. What you've overcome shows character. Northwestern University's acceptance letter arrived on a snowy March afternoon. Uncle Frank opened a bottle of champagne he'd been saving for a special occasion, pouring a small glass for me despite being underage. To new beginnings, he toasted, pride evident in his expression. That evening, while still riding the high of acceptance, I received an email that crashed through my carefully constructed piece. The sender was my mother, her first direct communication in nearly 4 years. Dearest Ramon, it began with jarring familiarity. We've been thinking about you constantly and miss you terribly. Your father and I have established ourselves well here and would love for you to visit during your spring break. We have so much to catch up on and explain. We never stopped loving you, sweetheart. People make mistakes, but family is forever. Please respond soon with dates that work for you. Love, Mom. Attached were photos of their beachfront home and my parents looking tanned and relaxed. No mention of the years of silence. No acknowledgement of the birthdays and holidays missed. Just a casual invitation, as if they'd been away on an extended business trip rather than having abandoned their child. I sat staring at the screen for nearly an hour before printing the email and taking it to Uncle Frank. He read it silently, his expression carefully neutral. What do you think? I asked, my voice unsteady. I think the timing is interesting, he replied carefully. Your high school graduation is coming up, and you've been accepted to Northwestern. These are achievements, worth celebrating and potentially benefiting from. When I looked confused, Uncle Frank sighed and placed the printout on his desk. Ramon, there's something you should know. The private investigators I hired didn't just track your parents' whereabouts. They've monitored their financial situation as well. He opened his laptop and pulled up a spreadsheet that detailed my parents' spending over the past year. Luxury purchases, expensive restaurants, gambling debts at Brisbane casinos. The final row showed their current account balances, nearly depleted. People rarely change their fundamental nature, Uncle Frank said gently. Your parents have burned through the money they took when they left, plus what they borrowed from me. Now they're looking for their next source of funds. The realization hit me with crushing clarity. They found out you're wealthy, and I'm your heir. Uncle Frank nodded. It's possible. Likely, even. How? I asked, my hands clenching into fists. Hayward Developments was featured in Business Week last month. Your graduation announcement will be in the Chicago Tribune Society pages next week. Information travels, especially when people are motivated to find it. I stared at the email again, seeing it with new eyes. The calculated warmth, the convenient timing, the absence of any real accountability. What should I do? I asked, torn between lingering childish hope and the adult wisdom Uncle Frank had instilled in me. That's entirely your decision, he replied. But remember this. Genuine love doesn't abandon you when times are tough and reappear when there's something to gain. After days of internal debate, I composed a brief, polite response, declining their invitation, citing academic commitments. I explained that I was in a good place in my life and not ready for a reunion. I ended with a simple truth. People make choices, and those choices have consequences that can't always be undone with an email. They replied immediately with effusive understanding and promises to try again when the timing is better. Uncle Frank said nothing when I showed him their response, but his approving nod contained all the validation I needed. That summer before college, I threw myself into learning more aspects of Uncle Frank's business. Something had shifted in me after the email exchange. A remaining thread of childish fantasy had been severed, replaced by clearer vision and purpose. I wanted to prove to myself, and perhaps to my absent parents, that I was building something valuable without them. "You're going to surpass me someday," Uncle Frank remarked as we reviewed my analysis of potential investment properties. "You see patterns I miss." "I had a good teacher," I replied. Uncle Frank smiled, but something in his expression seemed suddenly tired. Teachers are only as good as their students are willing to be. Looking back, I should have noticed the signs then. The slight weight loss, the occasional wince when he moved too quickly, the way he sometimes seemed short of breath after climbing stairs. But I was 18, focused on my future, and finally free of my past. I didn't realize that Uncle Frank was hiding something that would soon change everything again. Northwestern University's campus bustled with energy on move-in day. Uncle Frank insisted on driving me personally rather than sending Carter, helping carry boxes to my dorm room despite my protests that I could manage alone. "Indulge me," he said with a smile. "This is a rite of passage I don't want to miss." We arranged my sparse belongings in the small shared room, while my roommate Tyler unpacked his considerably larger collection of possessions. Uncle Frank chatted easily with Tyler's parents, never revealing through word or expression that I lacked the traditional family unit they represented. Before leaving, Uncle Frank handed me an envelope. "Not for emergencies," he explained. "For opportunities. College is about experiences as much as education." Inside was $5,000 in cash and a credit card in my name linked to his account. I tried to protest the generosity, but he waved away my concerns. "Money is just a tool, Ramon. What matters is how wisely you use it." My first semester passed in a blur of challenging classes, new friendships, and the intoxicating freedom of independence. I called Uncle Frank weekly, updating him on my business courses and campus life. During fall break, I returned to Chicago to find he had converted part of my bedroom into a study area, with dual monitors and professional reference materials. "Your midterm grades were impressive," he noted over dinner. "Particularly Professor Lawrence's economic theory course. He rarely gives A's." I shrugged, embarrassed by the praise. "The concepts make sense to me." "Because you've seen their practical application," Uncle Frank replied. "Theory without practice is just intellectual exercise. You have both." By sophomore year, I had declared a double major in economics and urban development, a combination that aligned perfectly with eventually joining Hayward Developments. Uncle Frank arranged summer internships, not with his own company but with partners and even competitors. "You need perspective beyond my methods," he explained. "Learn from everyone, then develop your own approach." I excelled in these positions, earning recommendations that opened doors without relying on Uncle Frank's name. My confidence grew alongside my skills, and I began to see a clear path for my future. The abandoned 14-year-old felt like a different person, entirely someone I remembered, but no longer embodied. During winter break of junior year, I noticed Uncle Frank taking phone calls behind closed doors and scheduling appointments that he deflected questions about. His energy seemed diminished, though he maintained his rigorous work schedule. The truth emerged accidentally. I arrived home unexpectedly after a canceled class and overheard Uncle Frank in conversation with Carter in his study. "The doctors want to begin treatment immediately," Carter was saying, his normally composed voice tinged with concern. "And compromise the Jensen project?" Uncle Frank replied dismissively. "The cancer isn't going anywhere, but that opportunity might. We proceed as planned." I froze outside the door, the word cancer echoing in my mind. My inadvertent noise must have alerted them, as the conversation stopped abruptly. "Ramon?" Uncle Frank called out. Is that you? I entered the study, unable to disguise my shock. You're sick, I stated flatly. How long have you known? Uncle Frank sighed, dismissing Carter with a nod. Sit down, son. The diagnosis was stage 3 pancreatic cancer, discovered during a routine physical 2 months earlier. The prognosis was uncertain but generally poor for this aggressive form. Uncle Frank had been consulting specialists while hiding his condition from me. Why wouldn't you tell me? I demanded, anger masking my fear. Because you're building your life, he replied simply. Your education, your growth. These things shouldn't be interrupted by my medical issues. They're not medical issues, they're cancer, I shouted, losing composure entirely. And you're not just my guardian, you're my family, my only real family. Uncle Frank's expression softened. That's precisely why I didn't tell you. I didn't want you dropping everything to play nursemaid. That's not what I need from you. What do you need then? I asked, my voice breaking. I need you to accelerate your training, he replied calmly. I need you ready to step into leadership roles at the company sooner than we planned. I need you to learn everything I haven't had time to teach you yet. That conversation marked the beginning of an intensified education. I reduced my course load at Northwestern to spend more time at Hayward Developments, learning directly from Uncle Frank. He introduced me to the board members, key investors, and crucial business partners. He shared confidential strategies and hard-won wisdom about navigating business challenges. People are the variable that spreadsheets can't account for, he advised during contentious negotiations with a difficult partner. Understand their motivations, and you'll predict their actions more accurately than any algorithm. Between his treatments and business lessons, Uncle Frank began formal succession planning. He updated legal documents, arranged meetings with financial advisors, and transferred significant assets to trust funds in my name. I'm not giving up, he assured me one evening, when the weight of these preparations felt overwhelming. I'm being pragmatic. Hope for the best, plan for the worst. That's always been my approach. During my senior year, Uncle Frank's condition stabilized with aggressive treatment. He lost weight and much of his hair, but his mind remained sharp and focused on both business and my development. He attended my graduation ceremony, standing proudly, despite obvious physical discomfort. Your parents have no idea what they missed, he remarked as we reviewed my diploma afterward. Their loss has been my greatest gain. After graduation, I joined Hayward Developments full-time as a project development associate. Despite my connection to Uncle Frank, I received no special treatment in title or compensation. If anything, other employees scrutinized my work more carefully, looking for signs of nepotism or entitlement. Prove yourself through results, not relationship, Uncle Frank advised. That's how you'll earn their genuine respect. 6 months into my role, Uncle Frank allowed me to lead my first independent project, the renovation of a struggling community center in a historically neglected neighborhood. The budget was modest by company standards, but the visibility was high due to community interest and political connections. I threw myself into the project, leveraging relationships I'd built during internships and applying lessons from both academic studies and Uncle Frank's mentorship. When unexpected structural issues threatened the timeline and budget, I negotiated with contractors and materials suppliers to find creative solutions. The completed renovation came in under budget and ahead of schedule. More importantly, it preserved architectural elements important to the community while modernizing facilities to serve current needs. The grand reopening garnered positive press coverage and appreciation from local leaders. Uncle Frank attended the ceremony, but stayed in the background, allowing me to receive recognition for the project's success. Later that evening, as we reviewed the financial statements, he nodded with satisfaction. You've surpassed expectations, he said simply. Not mine, I always knew what you were capable of, but your own. You're ready for more responsibility. Over the next year, my project load increased in both size and complexity. Uncle Frank's health seemed to stabilize with ongoing treatments, though he worked shorter days and delegated more decisions. Our professional relationship evolved as he transitioned from direct mentor to strategic advisor. You're developing your own style, he observed after watching me lead a staff meeting. Less formal than mine, but equally effective. People respond well to your approach. What neither of us knew was that our carefully structured transition plan was about to be dramatically accelerated by circumstances beyond our control and by the unexpected reappearance of people I'd hoped never to see again. The first sign of trouble came during a routine quarterly board meeting. Uncle Frank was presenting our 5-year expansion strategy when he suddenly paused mid-sentence, seeming momentarily confused. He recovered quickly, attributing the lapse to fatigue, but I noticed board members exchanging concerned glances. Carter whispered something to him, and Uncle Frank nodded almost imperceptibly, before continuing with uncharacteristic brevity. Later that afternoon, I found him in his office reviewing medical documents rather than the contract negotiations scheduled for his attention. "The cancer's progressing," he stated without preamble when he noticed me in the doorway. "The treatment protocol isn't working as effectively anymore." I sat heavily in the chair across from his desk. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means we need to accelerate our timeline," he replied pragmatically. "The doctors are suggesting more aggressive options, but the prognosis—" He trailed off, shuffling the papers. "Let's just say I'm being realistic about outcomes." Over the next several months, Uncle Frank's condition deteriorated more rapidly than either of us had anticipated. He transitioned to working from home most days, conducting video conferences from his study and requiring more frequent rest periods. I took over daily operations at Hayward Developments, consulting him on major decisions but increasingly making them independently. "You're doing exceptionally well," he assured me during our evening strategy sessions. "Better than I would have at your age." "I had advantages you didn't," I reminded him, "including you." Despite his declining health, Uncle Frank insisted on maintaining certain rituals. Sunday dinners remained sacred, though Mrs. Winters now prepared meals according to his dietary restrictions. Monthly charitable board meetings continued, with Uncle Frank participating even when visibly uncomfortable. "Legacy isn't just about business assets," he explained when I suggested he skip a particularly difficult meeting. "It's about the values you demonstrate consistently, especially when it's challenging." As news of his illness spread through business and social circles, an unexpected email arrived in my inbox one Tuesday morning. The sender's address made my stomach clench. "Linda Hayes, my mother. Dearest Ramon." It began with the same artificial warmth as her previous message years earlier. "We've just heard about Frank's health struggles and are devastated by the news. Your father and I have been doing some soul searching, and we realize how much we've missed by not being part of your life these past years. We've made terrible mistakes but would like the opportunity to make amends to Frank and to you. Family should come together during difficult times. Please let us know if we can call or visit. All our love, Mom and Dad." I stared at the message for several minutes before forwarding it to Carter with a brief note asking him to verify its authenticity. His response came within hours. The email had indeed come from Australia, from an account registered to Linda Hayes. That evening, I showed the message to Uncle Frank. He read it carefully, his expression unreadable. "What do you think?" I asked, watching him closely. "I think people often find clarity when mortality enters the equation," he replied neutrally. "The question is whether that clarity is about relationship or resources." "You think they're after your money?" I stated flatly. Uncle Frank sighed. "I think it's interesting timing that they've discovered family feeling just as my health has become public knowledge." "So you think I should ignore them?" I prompted. "I think you should decide based on what you need, not what they want," he countered. "Would seeing them provide closure for you? Would it help you move forward? Those are the relevant questions." After considerable reflection, I responded to my mother's email with cautious openness, agreeing to a video call but making no promises beyond that initial conversation. Uncle Frank offered to participate, but respected my decision to speak with them alone first. The video call was surreal. My parents had aged, though they both looked healthier and more relaxed than I remembered. They expressed remorse that seemed rehearsed, offering explanations rather than apologies for their abandonment. "We were in a terrible financial situation," my father explained. "We thought you'd be better off with Frank while we established ourselves." "We always intended to send for you," my mother added quickly. "But then time passed, and it seemed you were doing so well." They asked surface-level questions about my education and career, but showed more interest when I mentioned my position at Hayward Developments. Their inquiries became increasingly focused on Uncle Frank's condition and the company's future. "Frank always was brilliant with investments," my father remarked with forced casualness. "I imagine he's built quite an empire by now." The conversation confirmed what Uncle Frank had suspected. Their renewed interest correlated directly with his illness and the potential inheritance it implied. I ended the call with non-committal promises to stay in touch, my childhood longing for reconciliation finally replaced by clear-eyed acceptance of who they truly were. Uncle Frank listened to my account of the conversation without interruption. When I finished, he nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the most valuable lessons are the most painful to learn," he said. "You deserved better parents, Ramon. But their failings helped shape your character in ways that better parenting might not have." Against my better judgment, but honoring Uncle Frank's advice about closure, I agreed to an in-person meeting when my parents announced plans to visit Chicago the following month. They arrived looking expensively dressed and immediately asked about seeing Uncle Frank. "He's having a good day," I replied carefully. "He's agreed to a brief visit." The reunion between the brothers was a study in contrasts. Uncle Frank, though physically diminished, radiated a quiet dignity and composure that made him seem the stronger presence despite his illness. My father, outwardly robust but morally compromised, appeared smaller somehow in his brother's presence. "It's been a long time, Jack," Uncle Frank greeted him simply. "Linda, you look well." My parents launched into effusive expressions of concern and reminiscences that rang hollow given the years of silence. Throughout their performance, Uncle Frank remained politely attentive, but reserved. I watched him carefully, noting the calculating assessment behind his eyes as my parents spoke. To my surprise, Uncle Frank invited them to stay for dinner, during which he asked detailed questions about their life in Australia, their work, their social connections. He even suggested they might visit again before returning home, an offer they eagerly accepted. "Why are you being so nice to them?" I demanded after they left. "They abandoned me, borrowed money they never repaid, and now they're obviously circling like vultures." Uncle Frank smiled slightly. "Sometimes the best way to understand people's motivations is to give them enough rope to reveal themselves." Over the following weeks, my parents ingratiated themselves into our lives with increasing frequency. They visited Uncle Frank when I was at work, brought expensive wines despite his restricted diet, and asked increasingly specific questions about his estate planning and business succession. "Frank seems very fond of you," my mother remarked, during one of our increasingly strained interactions. "Though I worry he's placed too much responsibility on your shoulders. You're still so young to be managing such complex business affairs." "I've had excellent training," I replied tersely. "Of course, dear," she agreed too quickly. "But business acumen often comes with maturity. Your father has decades of sales experience that might be valuable to the company during this transition period." I nearly laughed at the transparency of their maneuvering but maintained my composure. "I'll keep that in mind." What I didn't tell them was that Uncle Frank had been recording these conversations with my parents during my absence. During one particularly revealing exchange, they had suggested that I lacked the maturity to handle significant inheritance, and implied that, as family, they could help manage the transition of assets. They've approached my attorney as well, Uncle Frank informed me after showing me the recording, expressing concerns about your readiness to assume control of the company and suggesting a family trust arrangement that would give them oversight. Rather than feeling hurt, I felt oddly validated. The last lingering doubts about my parents' character had been definitively resolved. "What did your attorney say?" I asked. Uncle Frank smiled thinly. "Arthur has been with me for 30 years. He recognized their play immediately and assured them that all arrangements for succession were already legally established." As Uncle Frank's health declined further, my parents' visits increased in frequency, but decreased in duration. They made appearances at the hospital when treatments required overnight stays, always when other visitors were present to witness their devotion. They brought flowers that Uncle Frank was allergic to, and food he couldn't eat, creating the appearance of care without the substance. During a rare moment alone with Uncle Frank after a particularly difficult treatment session, I found him more contemplative than usual. "I've been thinking about legacy," he said, his voice weaker but his eyes still sharp. "Not just what we leave behind, but what we leave within people." "Your legacy is secure," I assured him. "The company, the foundation, everything you've built." He waved his hand dismissively. "Buildings fall. Companies change hands. Money gets spent. The only lasting legacy is the impact we have on others, how we change their lives, what we teach them about their own worth and potential." He reached for my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "My legacy isn't Hayward Developments, Ramon. It's you. What you become, how you live, the choices you make, that's what will remain of me." That conversation haunted me in the weeks that followed, as Uncle Frank's condition worsened dramatically. He entered hospice care at the penthouse, with medical staff present around the clock. My parents hovered at the periphery of this intimate circle, maintaining their performance of familial concern while constantly angling for private conversations with Uncle Frank's lawyers and financial advisors. One evening, returning from a board meeting I'd attended in Uncle Frank's place, I overheard my parents in conversation with a distant cousin of Uncle Frank's, whom they'd apparently befriended. "Ramon's a good kid," my father was saying, "but Frank has obviously been sheltering him from the harsher realities of business." The board members seemed concerned about his experience level. "Frank always did have a blind spot when it came to the boy," my mother added. "Guilt over our situation, I suppose. But family has to think practically at times like these." I cleared my throat loudly, ending their character assassination. The look of momentary panic on their faces would have been amusing under different circumstances. The next morning, I found Uncle Frank more alert than he had been in days, reviewing documents with his attorney, Arthur. "Perfect timing," Uncle Frank said when he noticed me. "We were just finishing some important paperwork. Arthur, would you give us a moment?" After the attorney left, Uncle Frank gestured for me to sit beside his bed. "Your parents have been busy," he said without preamble. "I know," I replied grimly. "I overheard them last night." Uncle Frank nodded. "They've been visiting me when you're at the office, expressing concerns about your readiness to lead, suggesting alternatives for asset management." My chest tightened with anger. "I'm sorry they're bothering you with this now." "Don't be," Uncle Frank replied, surprising me. "They've done us both a favor." At my confused expression, he continued, "I've always known who they are, Ramon. Now you do, too, completely, without doubt or reservation. That knowledge is painful but valuable. It frees you from false hope and misplaced loyalty." He reached for a folder on his bedside table. "I've made some final adjustments to my will. Nothing substantive has changed regarding your inheritance, but I've added some specific language I think you'll appreciate when the time comes." 3 days later, Uncle Frank passed away peacefully in his sleep with me by his side. In those final days, he had shared private wisdom and personal stories I'd never heard, cementing our bond, even as his physical presence was fading. My parents had visited briefly the evening before, performing grief for the nurses while whispering to each other when they thought I couldn't hear. In the days following his death, they inserted themselves into funeral arrangements, expressing opinions on everything from the service location to the obituary wording. They introduced themselves to business associates as Frank's family and spoke about him with an intimacy that years of estrangement had not earned them. Frank would have wanted a smaller, private service. My mother insisted to the funeral director. He was always such a modest man. I bit back a sharp retort, recognizing the absurdity of her claiming to know the preferences of a brother-in-law she hadn't spoken to for most of my life until his illness. Throughout this performance, I maintained a careful distance, focusing on genuine mourning rather than their theatrics. I coordinated with Carter to ensure Uncle Frank's actual wishes were honored and worked with Arthur to prepare for the will reading scheduled for the following week. The night before the reading, my father approached me at the penthouse, his expression a practiced mix of concern and paternal authority that might have been convincing had I not known him better. "Ramon, your mother and I have been talking," he began, settling into Uncle Frank's favorite chair without invitation. "We know tomorrow will be difficult for everyone, and we want you to be prepared for whatever Frank may have decided." "I'm well aware of Uncle Frank's wishes," I replied neutrally. "Of course," he continued smoothly, "but Frank's condition deteriorated so quickly at the end. His judgment might have been affected. Whatever happens, we want you to know that we're here to help you navigate the responsibilities that might come your way." I maintained my composure with effort. "I appreciate your concern, but I've been preparing for this responsibility for years." My father leaned forward, dropping his voice conspiratorially. "Son, running a company like Hayward Developments requires experience and connections. Frank may have given you a position, but business is about relationships built over decades. Your mother and I have those relationships. We could be invaluable partners during this transition." The transparent self-interest behind his offer might have wounded me years earlier. Now, it merely confirmed what Uncle Frank had helped me understand. Some people view relationships solely as transactions. My parents saw me not as a son to love, but as an access point to wealth they hadn't earned. "I'll keep that in mind," I replied noncommittally. "If you'll excuse me, I need to review some documents before tomorrow." As they left, I heard my mother whisper to my father, "He'll need us when reality sets in tomorrow." Frank couldn't possibly have left everything to a 30-year-old with barely any real business experience. I smiled slightly, thinking of Uncle Frank's final adjustments to his will and his promise that I would appreciate the specific language. For the first time since his death, I felt a flicker of anticipation cutting through my grief. Arthur Whitman's law office occupied the 42nd floor of a sleek downtown building with views of Lake Michigan. The conference room was arranged with precision. Leather chairs surrounding a mahogany table, water carafes at regular intervals, and folders placed at each seat. As executor of Uncle Frank's estate, Arthur had arranged for all relevant parties to attend the reading simultaneously. I arrived early, nodding to Carter, who was already seated, his expression appropriately somber. Board members from Hayward Developments filed in, along with representatives from Uncle Frank's charitable foundation. Mrs. Winters arrived with her husband, looking uncomfortable in formal clothes. Various business associates and friends took their assigned seats, creating a mosaic of the relationships that had defined Uncle Frank's life. My parents arrived last, having clearly devoted considerable time to their appearance. My mother wore an expensive black dress, accessorized with pearl earrings. I recognized as ones Uncle Frank had given her for Christmas many years ago before they'd abandoned me. My father's suit was new, his somber expression carefully constructed. "Ramon, darling," my mother whispered, embracing me with practiced concern. "How are you holding up?" "I'm managing," I replied simply, disengaging from her grip. They took seats directly across from me, exchanging meaningful glances as Arthur called the gathering to order. "Thank you all for coming today," he began formally. "As you know, we're here to discuss the last will and testament of Franklin Edward Hayward, who specified that all beneficiaries should be present for this reading to ensure complete transparency." Arthur adjusted his glasses and began reading the preliminary sections of the will, which included personal messages to friends and expressions of gratitude to long-term employees. Uncle Frank had arranged for generous severance packages and retirement funds for staff members, drawing appreciative murmurs from those present. Next came the charitable bequests. Substantial donations to educational institutions that had supported Uncle Frank's early career, funding for community development in neighborhoods where Hayward Developments operated, and endowments for arts organizations he had patronized. The foundation would continue with expanded funding for foster care advocacy and support services for families in crisis, a cause I knew had special meaning for him given my history. My parents shifted impatiently as these bequests were detailed, exchanging glances that betrayed their concern about how much of the estate was being directed away from potential inheritance. My father leaned forward each time Arthur turned a page, clearly waiting for mention of family allocations. Now, Regarding family bequests, Arthur continued, glancing briefly in my direction. Franklin was very specific about the distribution of his personal assets and business holdings. My parents straightened in their chairs, their expressions shifting to barely concealed anticipation. My mother reached for my father's hand in a gesture that might have appeared supportive to others but which I recognized as preemptive celebration. To my loyal assistant, Carter Williams, Arthur read, I leave the sum of $1 million in recognition of 16 years of exceptional service and friendship, along with my collection of vintage watches, which he has long admired, but too politely coveted. Carter blinked rapidly, clearly moved by the personal nature of the bequest. My parents' expressions tightened slightly at the substantial cash gift to a non-family member. Arthur continued through several smaller personal bequests before pausing to take a sip of water. When he resumed, his tone remained professional, but I noticed a subtle change in his posture as he turned to the next page. Regarding the remainder of my estate, including controlling interest in Hayward Developments, my personal investment portfolio, real estate holdings, and liquid assets, Arthur paused briefly. I have given considerable thought to their disposition. The room grew perfectly still. My parents leaned forward slightly, their expressions intense with anticipation. To my brother Jack Hayes and his wife Linda Hayes, Arthur continued, his voice clear and measured, who abandoned their 14-year-old son Ramon and left him in my care while they pursued financial opportunities abroad. The air seemed to crystallize as the blunt characterization registered with everyone present. Several people turned to stare at my parents, whose expressions transformed from expectation to shock. I leave the sum of $1 each, Arthur continued without inflection, and this message. The fortune you coveted will go to the son you discarded. Ramon not only inherited my wealth but earned it through his character, loyalty, and hard work qualities you failed to recognize or value. My mother's face drained of color. My father's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. Every head in the room turned toward them, then toward me, in a synchronized movement that fulfilled the exact scenario described in Uncle Frank's Hook, the one line that made every head in the room snap. This bequest comes with the condition that they acknowledge receipt in person and sign a waiver of contest against this will, Arthur added. Should they choose to challenge these terms, they will forfeit even this symbolic amount and face full disclosure of their abandonment in court proceedings. Arthur continued reading without pausing for reaction. To my nephew Ramon Hayes, whom I have had the privilege of raising and mentoring for the past 16 years, I leave the remainder of my estate in its entirety, including but not limited to controlling interest in Hayward Developments, all investment accounts, real estate holdings, and personal effects. The document included specific instructions about management structures, voting rights, and succession plans we had developed together during Uncle Frank's illness. He had constructed a seamless transition that acknowledged my youth while providing the support system necessary for successful leadership. Frank can't have been in his right mind, my father finally sputtered, breaking the stunned silence. He was heavily medicated during his final weeks. This will should be invalidated on grounds of diminished capacity. Arthur regarded him coldly. The will was executed 6 months ago and witnessed by 2 physicians who specifically certified Frank's mental competence. Additionally, there is extensive video documentation of your attempts to influence the distribution of assets during Frank's illness, which would be presented should you choose to contest. My mother, recovering her composure more quickly, adopted an expression of wounded dignity. This isn't about money, she insisted, though no one had suggested it was. We're simply concerned that Ramon lacks the experience to manage such extensive holdings. As his parents, we have his best interests at heart. Several board members exchanged knowing glances. Carter coughed discreetly into his hand, covering what might have been inappropriate laughter. Frank anticipated your concern, Arthur replied, turning back to the document. He included this personal message to address that very point. Jack and Linda, your sudden interest in Ramon's welfare coincides suspiciously with my declining health and his rising fortune. If you truly had his best interests at heart, you would have demonstrated that during the 16 years of his life that I had the privilege of witnessing. Ramon has proven himself through intelligence, diligence, and integrity qualities I recognized and valued, even when you did not. Your presence at this reading demonstrates not parental concern but financial opportunism of the most transparent kind. My mother gasped audibly. My father's face flushed dark red, his hands clenching into fists on the polished table surface. "This is outrageous," he growled. "We'll contest this will to the fullest extent of the law." Arthur smiled thinly. As I mentioned, Frank anticipated that response. He withdrew another document from his folder. "This is a complete record of your financial transactions following Ramon's abandonment, including misappropriated funds from his savings account, defaulted loans from Frank, and subsequent financial difficulties in Australia, resulting from gambling debts and luxury expenditures beyond your means." He placed the document on the table. "Frank instructed me to present this evidence in open court. Should you challenge the will, along with testimony from the private investigators who documented your complete lack of interest in Ramon's welfare until you became aware of his potential inheritance." The room had grown uncomfortable with the public airing of family dysfunction. Several attendees shifted in their seats, gazes averted from the unfolding drama. "Perhaps," Arthur suggested quietly, "you might wish to reconsider your position and accept the terms as written. The dollar is symbolic, but the waiver you'd sign would prevent further embarrassment for all concerned." My parents exchanged glances, the calculation evident in their expressions. After 16 years of emotional manipulation, they were finally confronted with consequences they couldn't charm or deceive their way around. "We'll need time to consider our options," my father finally stated, attempting to salvage some dignity from the situation. "Of course," Arthur agreed smoothly. "The offer remains open for 30 days, after which the conditions become void and the dollars are forfeit." The remainder of the will reading proceeded with details about trust structures and philanthropic commitments. Throughout it all, I remained composed, experiencing a complex mixture of grief for Uncle Frank and vindication for the 14-year-old boy who had once believed himself unworthy of his parents' love. As the meeting concluded and people began to disperse, offering condolences and congratulations in equal measure, my mother approached me, her expression a carefully constructed mask of maternal concern. "Ramon, surely you understand this isn't what Frank truly wanted," she began, reaching for my hand. "He was angry with us, understandably so, but family should stand together in times like these." I regarded her steadily, seeing clearly for perhaps the first time the manipulation that had once seemed like love. "Uncle Frank knew exactly what he wanted," I replied calmly. "He prepared me for this responsibility for 16 years, while you built a new life that didn't include me. The will simply formalizes what we all already knew." "We made mistakes," my father interjected, joining us. "But we're still your parents. Blood matters. Uncle Frank taught me that family is built through actions, not biology," I countered. "You made your choice 16 years ago. I'm simply honoring it." They stared at me, seemingly unable to comprehend that the abandoned child they'd discarded had grown into a man beyond their manipulation. In their expressions, I recognized something I'd seen in business negotiations: the dawning realization that they had catastrophically miscalculated their position and had no remaining leverage. "The 30-day offer stands," I said, gathering my documents. "After that, I'll consider the matter closed permanently. Goodbye." Walking away from them felt like shedding the final weight of childhood expectation, the lingering hope that somehow, someday, they would become the parents I had needed. Uncle Frank had given me one final gift: complete liberation from that unfulfilled longing. In the weeks that followed, I immersed myself in the dual responsibilities of grieving Uncle Frank and assuming leadership of his business empire. The board of directors, many of whom had known me since adolescence, provided support while respecting my authority. Carter remained an invaluable ally, his institutional knowledge helping smooth the transition. My parents, after consulting attorneys who undoubtedly confirmed the solidity of Uncle Frank's will, eventually signed the waivers and accepted their $1 inheritances. The certified checks remained uncashed, a final, petty gesture of defiance that affected me not at all. 6 months after the will reading, I established the Franklin Hayward Foundation for Youth Advocacy, focusing specifically on supporting abandoned and foster children. The foundation provided educational scholarships, mentoring programs, and transition assistance for young adults aging out of foster care. In its first year, we helped over 500 young people navigating circumstances similar to what I had experienced. On the anniversary of Uncle Frank's death, I visited his grave alone, bringing his favorite yellow roses rather than the traditional lilies he had always found depressing. "The company's doing well," I told him, feeling only slightly self-conscious about speaking aloud. "The West Side Development Project you started is ahead of schedule, and the community response has been positive. The foundation is making a real difference, too." A gentle breeze stirred the cemetery's oak trees, creating a rustling that seemed almost like a response. "I still miss your advice," I continued, "but I find myself asking what you would do in difficult situations, and somehow the answers come. You prepared me better than I realized." I placed the roses carefully against the simple but elegant headstone he had selected himself. "Thank you," I said simply, knowing he would understand the depth of gratitude those 2 words contained for taking in an abandoned boy, for seeing potential where my own parents had not, for transforming rejection into the foundation for growth, rather than bitterness. Uncle Frank had taught me that family isn't defined by genetics, but by choices, daily decisions to support, challenge, and value one another. My parents had made their choice 16 years earlier, and Uncle Frank had made his. In doing so, they had collectively taught me the most important lesson of all. Our worth isn't determined by those who leave us, but by those who choose to stay. Have you ever experienced someone in your life who saw potential in you that others missed? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that their worth isn't determined by those who leave them behind. Thank you for joining me for this deeply personal journey, and I wish you the clarity to recognize your true family, the people who choose you every day.